Behind Beijing's September 3rd parade, what kind of lies are being hidden? Why did the Beijing really join the anti-Japanese war? What were they fighting for? And in the end, who truly defeated Japan? Let's cut through the propaganda and uncover the truth. Welcome back to Final War with Katherine Hu. For weeks, Beijing has been preparing for its September 3rd military parade. State propaganda has gone into overdrive, churning out endless articles, repeating old slogans about the anti-Japanese war, China's war of resistance against Japan, and wrapping it all in the banner of so-called patriotism. But here's the problem. The more the propaganda campaign talks, the more it exposes its own contradictions. Instead of proving strength, it reveals weakness. Instead of inspiring pride, it exposes embarrassment. And nowhere is this clearer than in the party's own numbers. On August 21st, Beijing's flagship mouthpiece, Xinhua News Agency, published an article titled "Explaining the Arrangements for the 81st Anniversary Victory Parade." They claimed that communist forces were the pillar of resistance in the anti-Japanese war. To back it up, they pointed to banners from units like the 8th Route Army, the new 4th Army, the Northeast Resistance, and South China Guerrillas, saying these flags would be proudly displayed in the parade. But here's the problem. The units Xinhua News Agency listed, the 8th Route Army, the new 4th Army, scattered guerrilla bands, were never enough to justify the claim of being the pillar of resistance. The reality is clear. It was the nationalist army that carried the main burden of fighting Japan. The communist forces, at best, played a limited supporting role. In fact, by citing these minor units, Xinhua News Agency's own propaganda accidentally revealed the truth it was trying to hide. In reality, the so-called communist guerrilla warfare was only a small fraction of China's broader resistance. Across Japanese-occupied territory, hundreds of thousands of nationalist troops were engaged in active guerrilla campaigns. In the Northeast, there were countless local resistance groups, some linked to the nationalist government, others entirely civilian-led uprisings, and the vast majority had nothing to do with the communists. But the party deliberately blurred the lines, slapping the label of the Northeast Anti-Japanese United Army on everything and trying to claim all the credit for China's guerrilla war. Xinhua News Agency went even further. In the same article, it claimed that the militias were the foundation of victory, boasting that over 2.6 million militia members took part in the anti-Japanese war, and that they claimed to have killed more than 106,000 enemy troops. At first glance, that might sound impressive, but let's put it into context. According to Japanese medical records from the war in China, 450,000 to 700,000 Japanese soldiers were reported dead in combat. More than 1.93 million were wounded or went missing, bringing total casualties to over 2.5 million. Now compare that to the party's claim. Even with exaggerated figures, they could only piece together 106,000 enemy losses. And that number lumps Japanese troops together with Japanese puppet forces. In other words, communist forces accounted for only a tiny fraction of the actual fight. Their battlefield record in the anti-Japanese war was almost negligible. Japanese records also show that puppet troops, those who collaborated with Japan, suffered between 288,000 and 575,000 deaths. plus another 742,000 wounded. That's nearly 1 million casualties among puppet forces alone. Put it all together, and the combined Japanese and puppet army losses during the war were between 3.0 and 3.6 million. And what did the party claim? Just 106,000. That's only about 2.9 to 3.5% of total enemy casualties. So let's be honest. The communist forces didn't fight many battles at all. Their own numbers betray them. The so-called pillar of resistance collapses under the weight of simple arithmetic. On August 25th, People's Daily ran a piece titled, "The CCP's role as the pillar of resistance was the key to victory in the anti-Japanese war." It claimed that the party was both the pillar of resistance and the political leadership core. But why the sudden emphasis on political core? Because their military record could never justify the title of pillar. The truth is stark. After Japan's invasion in 1931, the party made no real move to resist. By 1934, they were still entrenched in Jiangxi province, running their base like local warlords, undermining the nationalist government rather than fighting Japan. In 1935, that base was wiped out. The Red Army was shattered, and what remained of the leadership had to flee, eventually retreating all the way to Yan'an City in western China. And only then, in order to survive, did they suddenly raise the banner of resisting Japan. But even then, their forces never entered the real front lines. Then came December 12, 1936, the Xi'an incident. Under communist encouragement, two warlords, Zhang Xueliang of the Northeast Army and Yang Hucheng of the 17th Route Army, staged a coup in Xi'an. They held China's top commander, Jiang Jieshi, under house arrest, the very man leading the war effort against Japan. The CCP sought to remove Jiang Jieshi, but the supreme leader of the Soviet Union, Stalin, stepped in, ordering them to release him. Why? Because Moscow needed Jiang to keep fighting Japan, to shield the Soviet Union from threats on its eastern front. The so-called United Front was never about resisting Japan. For the CCP, it was nothing more than a political tool against the nationalist government, a desperate strategy for survival, not for national defense. In other words, the ruling party wasn't saving China, it was saving itself. Former Chinese Supreme Leader Mao Zedong himself later admitted it openly. On September 27, 1972, when Mao met Japanese Prime Minister Kakue Tanaka in Beijing, Mao said,
"We must thank Japan. Without Japan's invasion of China, we would not have had cooperation with the nationalists. We would not have been able to grow. And in the end, we could never have taken power. It is with your help that we are here today in Beijing to meet you."
People's Daily also pointed to Mao's 1938 essay, a 50,000-word speech titled On Protracted War. They praised it as a masterpiece of political mobilization, claiming it unified the resistance against foreign invasion with social progress and awakened the masses. But what did it really say? At its core, On Protracted War was not a roadmap to victory. It was an admission that Japan could not be defeated head-on. The best China could do was drag out the conflict and hope time and foreign powers would tip the scales. The irony is, the nationalist government had already adopted this strategy long before Mao put pen to paper. After the bloody 1937 Battle of Shanghai, Jiang Jieshi relocated the capital to Chongqing, laying out a long-term plan to fight a drawn-out war of resistance. Mao's essay came a year later, in 1938. By then, the concept of protracted resistance was already national policy. So what was on protracted war really? It was a political afterthought, an attempt to catch up with reality and claim credit for a strategy that was never his to begin with. And the reality on the ground proved it. The imbalance between Chinese and Japanese forces was overwhelming. In the eastern and central plains, the Chinese army could barely hold a line, let alone force a stalemate. Only after retreating westward into China's rugged interior, into the mountains and valleys of the central and western provinces, could they finally use the terrain to wear down the invaders and stabilize the front. Back then, the nationalist government was in the same position as Ukraine is today. Without American aid, it would have been pushed into a losing position almost immediately on the battlefield. The so-called on-protracted war was never a brilliant theory. It was simply an admission. Japan could not be defeated, and behind it lay something even darker. The strategy was not about national survival. It was about communist survival. Let the nationalist army bleed itself dry against Japan. Meanwhile, the Red Army would stay in the shadows, conserving strength, waiting for the day it could turn its guns on fellow Chinese in the coming civil war. To blur the truth, the party loves to exaggerate its so-called enemy behind the lines operations and guerrilla campaigns. But just look at today's war in Ukraine. It's obvious. The decisive battles are fought head-on at the front lines. That's where wars are won or lost. 80 years ago, in August 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima, the other on Nagasaki. That forced Japan to surrender on August 15th, bringing World War II to an end. Only then could China be counted among the victors. Only then could the war be called a victory. In other words, it was America that defeated Japan, not the Chinese Communist Party. The party didn't lead China to victory. It simply rode on America's victory and claimed the credit. While the nationalists were fighting the Japanese, the Communist Party was busy with something else: internal purges. In 1942, at the height of the war, Mao Zedong launched the Yan'an rectification campaign. Thousands of young people who had gone to Yan'an, full of hope, were caught in political witch hunts, purges, and harsh repression. Even Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongxun, was nearly destroyed during this period. So much for fighting Japan. The party's priority was never the battlefield. It was consolidating Mao's personal control. And history is repeating itself today. After more than a decade of purges, Xi Jinping has created chaos inside the party and the military. Once again, Beijing is more concerned with eliminating internal rivals than with facing external threats. Parade for survival. So, what is this parade really about? Beijing calls this parade a commemoration of victory. In fact, this parade makes no attempt to hide its true priority. By putting the party commands the gun front and center, Beijing has turned the event into a political stage show. It isn't about honoring history. It's about protecting the party. A desperate display meant to convince ordinary Chinese people that the ruling party is still solid, when in reality, its foundations are shaking. But that's the irony. The very need for such a parade proves just how fragile the system really is. Zhongnanhai is desperate, clinging to grand military pageantry as a stage prop to hold up its crumbling authority. That's why Beijing is rehearsing the parade again and again, terrified that any mistake could be seen as weakness. Tens of thousands of soldiers marching in lockstep across Tiananmen Square, not to prepare for real combat, but to reassure the leadership that the army is still under control, but a military that spends more time practicing goose steps than real combat training. Can that military be trusted in a real war? A parade can't cover up corruption. A parade can't fix low morale. And a parade can't save a ruling party whose greatest fear is that its own army may stop listening. Beijing loves to claim it won the anti-Japanese war, but its own propaganda betrays the truth. It survived thanks to Japan's invasion, relied on Soviet protection, and later even absorbed Japanese soldiers to fight its civil war. Today, by trying to glorify its past through military parades, it only reminds the world of its fragile present. The more Beijing shows off, the more it reveals just how shaky its grip on power really is. And that, ironically, is the real message of this parade. Get the real story behind the CCP's shifting power games and see where US-China relations are headed next. Support the vision of a new China without communism. Subscribe now and join us in bringing the truth to light.